Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're looking at a stack of sources that honestly, at first glance, just look like your standard, somewhat dry diplomatic itinerary.
Right, yeah. Lots of schedules and official memos.
And exactly. Like, it's May 11th and 12th, 2026. We are in Nairobi, Kenya for the Africa Forward Summit. And if you just read the headlines, you think, okay, another summit, world leaders shaking hands, taking photos, reading these pre-approved, incredibly boring statements.
Maintaining the geopolitical status quo, basically.
Yeah, exactly. But once you actually get into these documents, and we're going to unpack all of this for you today, it is wild. This summit is essentially shredding the predictable script of international relations.
It really is. I mean, the documentation from these 2 days in Nairobi presents a pretty stark reality. The old post-Cold War architecture, the one with unquestioned Western dominance and this unipolar center of gravity.
We all grew up with, yeah.
Right. It's just no longer functional. What we're seeing in these sources is Africa actively transitioning. They're moving from being this geopolitical battleground or just a passive subject of development policy.
Those where things happen to them.
Exactly. And now they are functioning as a central architect of global economics, digital infrastructure, and really international governance itself.
So our mission today for everyone listening is to decode the mechanics of that shift. We're analyzing the official agendas, economic breakdowns, all the policy papers from this 2026 summit, because this single event signals the absolute death of those old post-colonial dynamics.
Yeah, we are going to look at France's massive $27 billion investment pivot.
Which is huge.
It is, and the structural demands from African leaders to just completely overhaul the Bretton Woods financial system, plus the rapid expansion of African digital sovereignty.
And we can't forget strategic non-alignment.
Right, the ultimate geopolitical leverage. But to accurately analyze this structural shift, we really need to begin with the most immediate anomaly of the summit itself.
Which is just the location, right?
Exactly. The geography of this meeting is a primary geopolitical signal in itself. Emmanuel Macron co-hosted this massive summit with Kenyan President William Ruto in Nairobi.
Which is, if you follow this stuff, it's a huge deal.
It's massive. To understand the gravity of Paris completely bypassing its traditional spheres of influence to set up this diplomatic anchor in Anglophone East Africa, we have to look really closely at the systemic collapse of France's historical strategy in West and Central Africa.
Right. You're talking about the dissolution of the France-Afrique network.
Yes, exactly.
And I think a lot of you listening are probably well aware of the historical resource extraction and the political maneuvering in that region. But looking at these sources, it indicates a total operational breakdown of French influence in the Sahel leading up to 2026.
It wasn't a gradual decline at all.
No, it was like a rapid cascading expulsion.
Yeah, it was a fundamental structural failure of a military-first foreign policy. Over the last few years, we saw this incredible domino effect of military coups across the Sahel.
Specifically in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger.
Right. And the younger, highly mobilized populations in these nations, they just actively rejected the ongoing presence of French military operations. Things like Operation Barkhane.
Which had been there for a long time, right?
Over a decade. Yeah. And it had fundamentally failed to contain the regional insurgencies. But the rejection, and this is key, it went far beyond just the troops on the ground.
It was economic, too.
Completely. It was a comprehensive repudiation of the economic tethers that had bound these nations to Paris for literally decades. Most notably, the CFA franc monetary system.
Okay, let's get into the mechanics of that, because the CFA franc, it isn't just this controversial symbol, right? It's a structural economic mechanism that fundamentally limits a country's sovereignty.
Yes, it limits it entirely.
When activists in the Sahel were demanding a break from France, they weren't just protesting. They were targeting the very architecture of their national reserves.
Precisely. The CFA franc system historically required member states to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves directly into the French treasury.
Wait, half of their reserves just sitting in Paris?
Just sitting there. And the currency was pegged strictly to the euro. So proponents of this system, they'd always argue that this provided macroeconomic stability, curbed inflation.
Sure, on paper that sounds okay.
But the reality on the ground was that it stripped these African central banks, the BCEAO in West Africa and the BEC in Central Africa, of their ability to control their own monetary policy.
So they couldn't react to their own crises.
Exactly. If a localized economic crisis hit, They couldn't just adjust their currency valuation to make their exports more competitive. They were entirely financially tethered to whatever the economic priorities of the Eurozone were at that moment.
Wow. So when anti-French sentiment reached this absolute boiling point, culminating in them literally expelling French ambassadors and troops from Bamako, Ouagadougou, Niamey, France was just staring down a complete loss of leverage.
Complete loss.
Yeah.
And then Russia's Africa Corps moves in to fill the security vacuum.
Right.
China accelerates its infrastructure debt diplomacy. And Turkey starts aggressively exporting security hardware.
So just to give a sort of analogy here, this is essentially a massive geopolitical rebrand, right? It's like a brand moving its flagship store to a new city because everyone in the old neighborhood is actively boycotting them.
That is exactly the strategic context for Nairobi. France realized its paternalistic, security-heavy model was completely obsolete. So this pivot to Kenya, it was a very calculated move to establish a new operational base.
In a region that's known for relative stability.
Stability, massive technological growth, and crucially, a total lack of that specific France-Afrique historical baggage. Nairobi is the undisputed diplomatic hub of East Africa right now.
Yeah, I mean, it houses the UN Environment Program headquarters.
Exactly. And it's recently positioned itself as the primary mediator for regional conflicts. Plus, it's a vanguard for climate diplomacy, especially after that 2023 Africa Climate Summit.
Right, but, showing up in a brand new neighborhood requires serious capital, especially when your geopolitical competitors are already deeply entrenched.
You can't just show up empty-handed.
No, you really can't. Which brings us to the absolute centerpiece of this summit, the money. We are talking about a planned investment package of approximately 23 billion euros, which is about 27 billion US dollars.
It's a staggering amount of money.
It is. But looking at the term sheets and how they framed this diplomatically in these sources, the language they use is highly, highly specific. Macron explicitly moved away from using words like developmental assistance or aid.
Right.
He framed this entirely around the concept of co-investment.
And that shift from assistance to co-investment, it represents a fundamental change in how we view the cost of capital and the expected return. Traditional development aid, it often functioned as a mechanism for donor countries to dictate domestic policy in the recipient nation.
Right. It was always heavily laden with conditionalities, like giving someone an allowance but telling them exactly what they have to buy with it.
Exactly. But co-investment, it treats the African state not as a beneficiary or a charity case, but as an equity partner.
Like a venture capital term sheet. It's totally transactional.
It's a transaction. The $27 billion, it wasn't allocated for, mosquito nets or rudimentary agricultural subsidies. The capital was targeted directly at hard, future-facing infrastructure.
Like what?
We're talking sovereign data centers, massive climate resilience projects, maritime logistics.
Yeah, the logistics aspect is really highly visible in these sources. There's a specific concrete commitment highlighted here, a 700 million euro project led by the French shipping giant CMA-CGM.
To upgrade the port of Mombasa, yes.
Right, in Kenya. And we aren't talking about soft power here. Mombasa is the primary gateway for the entire northern corridor. It facilitates trade for landlocked countries like Uganda, Rwanda, South Sudan.
It's critical infrastructure.
So a 700 million euro upgrade, that fundamentally alters the deep water draft capacity. It changes the TEU, the 20-foot equivalent unit throughput of the entire region.
And critically, that investment is being driven by a private corporation, but it's supported by state mechanisms. And this brings us to the actual financial engineering underwriting this whole $27 billion package.
Okay, let's get into the weeds a bit on this.
Because to move capital at this scale into emerging markets, the summit relied heavily on deploying blended finance, mezzanine debt structures, and sovereign risk guarantees.
Okay, let's break down those sovereign risk guarantees for a second. If we look closely at how this co-investment actually functions, isn't France essentially just using public funds to absorb the volatility of the African market?
That's the basic idea, yeah.
So they are de-risking the venture for private French capital.
That is the exact utility of blended finance. Because institutional investors in the West, your pension funds, insurance conglomerates, they manage trillions of dollars.
Trillions, yeah.
But they have incredibly strict risk mandates. They generally cannot legally deploy capital into markets with a high perceived risk of sovereign default or severe currency devaluation.
It's just too risky for someone's retirement fund.
Exactly. So blended finance solves this by using a tranche of public or philanthropic capital to take the first loss position in a project.
Meaning, if this massive port expansion in Mombasa faces huge cost overruns, or there's a sudden macroeconomic shock, the French government, or like an associated development bank, takes the initial financial hit,
Right.
which protects the private investor's principal,
Yeah. It artificially lowers the weighted average cost of capital.
the WACC.
Right, the WACC. It makes a massive infrastructure project in Kenya financially viable for a conservative European pension fund.
That's fascinating.
So France is utilizing these credit enhancements to position its corporations right at the foundational level of Africa's industrialization. Because the overarching goal stated in these summit documents is the creation of sovereign capacity.
Right, which goes back to what African leaders have been saying. They've made it very clear they no longer want to just export raw materials so the rest of the world can keep their supply chains running.
No, they want the capital to build the infrastructure to refine those materials locally.
Which perfectly brings us to the most surprising focal point of this entire summit. Because if you look at the historical trajectory of foreign investment in Africa, it's almost exclusively centered on the extraction of physical resources.
Always. Gold, hydrocarbons.
And more recently, all those critical minerals for the global energy transition, like Congolese cobalt or Zimbabwean lithium.
Right.
But the primary focus of this 2026 summit wasn't subterranean at all, it was the cloud.
Yeah, the geopolitical center of gravity has totally shifted from physical resource extraction to digital sovereignty.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. The summit's intense concentration on artificial intelligence, hyperscale data centers, digital ecosystems, it represents a total reevaluation of Africa's strategic utility. For decades, the global north viewed the continent merely as the starting point of the supply chain.
Just a quarry, basically.
Exactly. Now, the infrastructure discussions in Nairobi, they position Africa as a primary developer of next-generation technology.
We're seeing a really concerted effort here to dismantle the whole legacy of digital extraction because the traditional model, it involved global tech giants extracting raw data from African users, processing it in massive server farms over in Europe or the US, training their algorithms, and then selling those digital products right back to the African continent.
The exact same extractive model, just applied to data instead of copper.
Exactly. But the infrastructure deals outlined in Nairobi, they're designed to localize that entire value chain.
We are looking at the massive capitalization of the Silicon Savannah in Kenya, the Kigali Innovation City in Rwanda.
Oh, and those massive fintech unicorns exploding out of Lagos, Nigeria.
Right. And the deployment of high-capacity subsea cables over the last few years has finally provided the actual physical bandwidth necessary to support localized cloud regions. By keeping the data processing on the continent, these nations drastically reduce latency, sure.
But more importantly,
they maintain legal jurisdiction over their citizens' data.
data sovereignty.
Exactly. And the AI component is so critical here.
Yeah, let's talk about the AI stuff. Because if large language models are trained exclusively on datasets originating from North America and Europe, they inherently inherit a profound structural bias.
They absolutely do.
They fail to understand local African languages, local legal contexts, or even basic economic realities. So by partnering with France on AI infrastructure, these African tech hubs are seeking the raw compute power necessary to build indigenous models.
Right.
But wait, let's look at the French motive here. Why is France so desperate to get in on the ground floor of African tech?
Because Paris is getting severely squeezed in the global tech race. You've got Silicon Valley on one side and Shenzhen on the other.
They are completely caught in the middle.
The European Union simply lacks the hyperscale cloud providers that dominate the US and Chinese markets. So by embedding their digital infrastructure companies into the fastest-growing tech ecosystems on the planet, France is attempting this massive strategic bypass.
Because the demographics are undeniable. By 2050, 1 in 4 humans on Earth will be African.
And the continent boasts the youngest, most rapidly digitizing population globally. Securing the architectural foundations of Africa's digital economy, it is quite literally a matter of long-term economic survival for Paris.
They need those markets.
They want their software, their regulatory frameworks, and their cloud services deeply integrated into the African market before Chinese or American tech monopolies achieve total lock-in.
So, okay, put yourself in this room. France arrives in Nairobi with $27 billion in blended finance, a willingness to build hard digital infrastructure, and a desperate need to secure market share.
Very strong opening hand.
Right. Historically, this is the exact point in the summit where the African delegation smiles, signs the communiques, accepts the capital, and everyone declares a diplomatic victory.
But the 2026 summit ruptured that dynamic completely.
They didn't just play along.
Not at all. President Ruto and the coalition of African leaders present, they did not just accept the terms. They leveraged the moment to aggressively demand a total restructuring of the global financial architecture.
Which is incredible to read in these transcripts. The transactional nature of the summit, the $27 billion, it was almost overshadowed by this profound structural challenge.
Yeah, the African delegation articulated a unified rejection of the 20th century financial order. They brought three highly specific, highly systemic demands to the negotiating table.
And these demands targeted the very mechanics that have historically constrained African economic agency. Let's go through them. The first demand targeted the global credit rating ecosystem.
Which sounds dry, but is huge.
It's a highly technical area, but the economic damage it inflicts is staggering. African finance ministers have argued for years that agencies like, Moody's, Fitch, Standard & Poor's, they apply a systemic perception premium to African sovereign debt.
Right, because the methodology used by these agencies to assess sovereign risk, it often relies really heavily on subjective institutional strength scores.
Which inherently disadvantage developing economies.
Absolutely. When a Western rating agency downgrades an African nation, or, assigns a sub-investment grade rating despite relatively stable macroeconomic fundamentals, it's not just a bad review.
No, it has real math attached to it.
It mathematically forces global bond investors to demand much higher yields to hold that debt.
We're talking about a severe mathematical penalty. Like if you have a European nation and an African nation and they have basically similar debt to GDP ratios, the African nation is routinely forced to pay yields that are 200 to 300 basis points higher on the international capital markets.
Simply due to geographical risk perception.
Simply because of where they are on the map. And that spread, that perception premium, translates into billions of dollars in excess debt servicing.
A capital that is actively siphoned away from building the very digital infrastructure and healthcare systems we were literally just discussing.
It's like sitting down to play Monopoly, but realizing the bank is fundamentally rigged against you from the very first roll. You don't just want your $200 for passing Yao, you want to rewrite the rule book.
Which logically leads directly into their second structural demand. A comprehensive overhaul of sovereign debt restructuring mechanisms.
Yeah, let's talk about that debt crisis, because the African continent is currently facing a massive maturity wall of Eurobonds that were issued over the last decade.
And you combine that with massive external shocks, the global pandemic, the subsequent supply chain inflation, the aggressive interest rate hikes by the U.S. Federal Reserve.
Oh, the Fed rate hikes were brutal for emerging markets.
Brutal. All of that has severely compounded debt-to-GDP ratios across the continent.
And the existing mechanisms to handle this debt distress are just fundamentally broken. The traditional Paris Club framework, which, for those who don't know, was designed to coordinate debt relief among Western creditor nations.
Like a very 20th century model.
Exactly. It's completely inadequate for the current landscape. Because today, a massive portion of African sovereign debt isn't held by Western governments. It's held by private commercial bondholders in London and New York.
Or by Chinese state-backed entities like the Exim Bank.
Right. So getting all those disparate creditors into a single room to agree on a haircut, a reduction in the principal owed, it has proven nearly impossible.
It leads to these protracted, agonizing defaults like we saw with Zambia.
It drags on for years.
Years. So the African leaders in Nairobi demanded a new, expedited, and actually equitable sovereign debt restructuring framework, one that forces private bondholders and bilateral creditors to negotiate symmetrically.
So that debt servicing doesn't consume, 60 to 70% of a nation's tax revenue?
Exactly. You can't govern a country if 70% of your taxes are just paying off old interest.
But, restructuring debt and recalibrating credit ratings, those are essentially just treating the symptoms of a much larger institutional imbalance. The third, and honestly the most aggressive demand articulated in Nairobi, was the immediate redistribution of power within the Bretton Woods institutions and the United Nations Security Council.
Because the global governance architecture, we have to remember, was designed in 1944.
Literally a different world.
Completely different. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, They operate on a quota system that concentrates all the voting power in the hands of the United States and Western Europe.
And this imbalance was starkly exposed recently during the issuance of special drawing rights, or SDRs.
Right, the SDRs.
Which, if you're not familiar, are essentially supplementary foreign exchange reserve assets created by the IMF.
Right, so during the height of the recent global economic crises, the IMF issued hundreds of billions of dollars in SDRs to inject liquidity into the global system.
Sounds great in theory.
It does. But because the allocation is tied directly to those existing IMF quotas, the vast majority of that liquidity went to wealthy Western nations.
Nations who didn't actually need it to stabilize their central banks.
Exactly. While the entire continent of Africa received a fractional percentage of it.
It is a mathematically regressive system. The rich literally get richer. So the demand in Nairobi wasn't just give us more capital. It was a demand for an immediate recalibration of the quota formulas to actually reflect current demographic and economic realities.
Furthermore, they reiterated the Izulwini Consensus.
Oh, explain that.
They are demanding at least 2 permanent seats with full veto power on the UN Security Council. They are highlighting the absolute absurdity of a system where a continent comprising over 1 billion people and holding the most critical resources for the global future is structurally excluded from the highest tier of international security decisions.
It fundamentally forces a question, right? If you are a structurally disadvantaged group, how do you force the architects of the system to rewrite the rules that keep them in power?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because yes, Emmanuel Macron expressed rhetorical support for broader representation, sure, but rhetorical support does not alter the voting quotas at the IMF.
No, words don't change the math.
If African nations cannot rely on the magnanimity of the G7 to dismantle their own institutional dominance, they have to rely on leverage.
And that leverage is currently unprecedented. It's derived from 2 intersecting vectors: demographic destiny and absolute control over the critical mineral supply chain.
Let's talk demographics first. By 2050, 25% of the global workforce will be situated in Africa.
1 in 4 workers. And while the populations of Europe, Japan, and even China are rapidly aging and facing severe demographic contraction, Africa's median age is roughly 19.
19. That is an unbelievable engine for growth. And then you combine that human capital with the periodic table.
Right.
The entire global transition away from hydrocarbons to renewable energy grids to electric vehicles, it requires staggering volumes of copper, cobalt, lithium, manganese, rare earth elements.
And where are those elements? The Democratic Republic of Congo alone produces roughly 70% of the world's cobalt. Zimbabwe holds massive lithium reserves.
You literally cannot build a green global economy or a localized AI data center without the geological assets resting beneath the African continent.
You can't.
And
recognizing this immense structural power, African states have fully weaponized a geopolitical strategy defined in the summit documents as strategic non-alignment.
which is such a fascinating term because during the Cold War, the Global South was largely forced into a binary paradigm, right? You align either with Washington or you align with Moscow.
Right, and then the post-Cold War era demanded alignment with the liberal democratic consensus.
But today, African nations are actively refusing that binary choice. They won't choose between the G7 and the expanding BRICS coalition or between the US and China.
It is the operationalization of extreme pragmatism. They are employing issue-based cooperation.
So essentially, they are leaving everyone on read. They're saying, we will work with whoever gives us the best deal on this specific issue today.
That's exactly it. If we look at recent voting patterns at the UN General Assembly regarding global conflicts, whether in Eastern Europe or the Middle East, African nations have consistently refused to vote uniformly as a bloc dictated by Western diplomatic pressure.
They abstain or they vote based entirely on their own sovereign national interest.
And by maintaining this stance of multi-alignment, they force a continuous, highly competitive bidding war among global powers.
Oh, I see. So if the United States imposes strict conditionality on infrastructure loans,
African states will just secure financing from Beijing.
and if China's debt terms become too onerous,
They turn to the European Union's Global Gateway Initiative.
and if France's security apparatus is deemed ineffective, like we saw in the Sahel,
They contract defense agreements with Ankara or Moscow.
this transactional fluidity, it completely neutralizes the leverage of traditional superpowers.
It diffuses power globally and ensures that African nations maintain absolute agency. They have transitioned from being pawns managed by foreign capitals to becoming the master architects of their own geopolitical strategy.
It's an incredible shift. But Okay, we've painted this picture of a massive, optimistic pivot, the $27 billion, the tech hubs, the newfound leverage.
Right.
But if we look at the online debates, the civil society reactions, there is a totally different, highly skeptical narrative playing out on the ground.
Yes, and we must rigorously analyze that skepticism because the sources detail a vibrant, highly critical counter-narrative driven by civil society organizations, local economic analysts, young African activists.
People who are viewing this entire Nairobi summit framework with profound suspicion.
Very much so.
So when we strip away the diplomatic gloss of that massive package, what do the local activists actually see? Because they're looking at the exact same blended finance mechanisms and AI infrastructure deals we just praised, but they are arriving at a deeply cynical conclusion regarding French motives.
The primary critique from the ground revolves around the mechanics of capital flight and the true nature of what co-investment actually means in practice.
Okay, unpack that.
Activists point out that when a massive French logistics conglomerate like CGM utilizes French sovereign risk guarantees to upgrade a Kenyan port.
The Mombasa project.
Right, the physical infrastructure gets built, sure. But the long-term revenue streams, the tolls, the operational fees, the maritime tariffs, where do those go? They will inevitably be repatriated to corporate headquarters in Marseille.
Ah, so the fear is that blended finance simply socializes the risk onto the public ledger while privatizing the long-term profits for European shareholders.
Exactly. The port stays in Mombasa, but the economic value generated by that port continuously bleeds out of the continent.
It's a highly sophisticated iteration of the same historical extraction model, just with better PR.
That's how the skeptics see it. And furthermore, this skepticism extends deeply into the digital realm, too. We discussed the desire for digital sovereignty earlier.
Right, the AI hubs and data centers.
But the counter-narrative suggests that allowing European tech giants to build the foundational architecture of the African cloud is simply transitioning from physical colonialism to digital colonialism.
Wow, the extraction of raw data instead of raw mineral.
Yes. If a French telecom or cloud provider builds the data center, who ultimately controls the algorithms? Who monetizes the consumer data of 1 billion African citizens?
That's a great question, because the activists are demanding to know if this $27 billion pivot actually includes the mandatory transfer of intellectual property and core technology, or if it merely solidifies African reliance on European tech ecosystems for the next century.
And this profound trust deficit is the central reality of modern Europe-Africa relations. You can't ignore it. For a highly educated, hyper-connected generation of young Africans, diplomatic rebranding, just changing the word assistance to partnership, is entirely insufficient.
Yeah, I mean, when a relationship has decades, centuries of historical baggage, a simple rebrand is a tough pill to swallow.
They possess an acute understanding of historical exploitation, from the CFA franc to the failures of military intervention. They recognize that France's presence in Nairobi was driven entirely by geopolitical desperation.
A need to survive the collapse of France-Afrique and secure relevance in a multipolar world.
Precisely. France needs Africa right now, far more than Africa needs France. And the activists know that.
So, synthesizing this immense volume of data from the Africa Forward Summit, the defining takeaway isn't really the money or the port upgrades or even the AI memorandums of understanding.
No, those are just the symptoms of the shift.
Right. The true legacy of this summit is the visible structural death of unipolarity. The global governance systems built in 1944 are buckling under the demographic and economic weight of the African continent.
The summit effectively formalized a new operational reality. Africa is utilizing its critical minerals, its burgeoning digital infrastructure, and its immense demographic momentum to enforce strategic non-alignment.
They are demanding the fundamental restructuring of global debt markets and institutional voting power.
And they are executing this by forcing the major geopolitical blocs into perpetual transactional competition.
The era of the predictable, heavily choreographed diplomatic script, where Western capitals just dictated the terms of global engagement, has been permanently shredded.
It's completely over.
So as we watch the subsequent rollout of these tech initiatives and infrastructure mega projects over the coming years, a critical question remains for you, the listener, to consider.
Yeah, think about this as you watch the news.
As digital sovereignty and critical resource control become the absolute baseline of international leverage, will the traditional Western powers be capable of dismantling their own institutional privileges to engage as genuine, equal partners? Or will their adherence to a decaying global order result in their total exclusion from the most vital economic engine of the 21st century?
It's going to be fascinating to watch unfold.
It really is.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of the new global architecture. We'll catch you next time.